A young nurse cared for a millionaire in a coma, but when he suddenly woke up, something shocking happened. What you're about to read will leave you speechless. Follow this incredible journey and don't forget to like, share, and tell us where you're reading from in the comments. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound that filled the dimly lit hospital room. Ilara Vaughn adjusted her scrubs and checked the time, 2 a.m. The night shift at Westlake Private Hospital was always quiet, but room 307 was different. It held secrets that kept her awake at night, mysteries that followed her home. Magnus Rowan, 38, lay motionless on the hospital bed. His strong jawline, now slightly hidden under a thin layer of stubble, gave no hint of the powerful businessman he once was. 6 months ago, his name dominated business headlines. Today, he couldn't even open his eyes. "Good evening, Mr. Rowan," Ilara said softly as she checked his vitals. "Your blood pressure is looking better today." Her voice echoed in the luxurious private suite. Unlike other hospital rooms, this one had expensive furniture, original artwork, and a window overlooking the city skyline. Money could buy comfort, but it couldn't wake Magnus from his coma. Ilara was still new to this assignment. At 25, she was the youngest nurse on staff, but when the previous nurse suddenly quit, Dr. Marshall had trusted her with the hospital's most important patient. "He's as good as gone," Nurse Hoffman had told her during handover. "The family just keeps him here because they can afford it. Trust me, honey, he's not coming back." But Ilara couldn't accept that. Something about Magnus fascinated her. Maybe it was the contrast between the powerful man in the business magazines and the vulnerable patient before her. Or perhaps it was the whispers among the staff, stories of ruthless business deals, mysterious enemies, and the unexplained circumstances of his accident. As she adjusted his IV, Ilara noticed a small wooden box on the bedside table. It hadn't been there during her previous shift. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a collection of personal items, a watch, a wallet, and a wrinkled yellowed piece of paper. She knew she shouldn't pry, but something pulled her toward that paper. It was a letter, torn in half. The handwriting was delicate, almost rushed. "Magnus, I need to warn you. They've discovered what we found in the company records. It's worse than we thought. If this gets out, people will die. Meet me tonight at our usual place. Don't tell anyone, especially not—" The rest was missing. Ilara's heart raced. She quickly returned the letter to the box, but her mind was spinning with questions. Who wrote it? What had Magnus discovered? And where was the other half? The door suddenly opened and Ilara jumped. Dr. Marshall walked in, his face tired from a long shift. "Everything okay, Vaughn?" he asked, glancing at the monitors. "Yes, doctor. Just checking his fluids." Dr. Marshall nodded and examined Magnus's pupils with a small flashlight. "No change," he sighed. "The family meeting is tomorrow. They'll want updates." "Do you think he'll ever wake up?" Ilara asked. The doctor's expression darkened. "Between us? The brain scans don't look promising. The damage from the accident was extensive. But what? I've seen stranger things happen. Just don't get attached. That's the first rule with coma patients." After Dr. Marshall left, Ilara sat beside Magnus. The rule was clear. Don't get attached. But as she looked at his face, peaceful yet somehow troubled, she knew it was already too late. "Who are you really, Magnus Rowan?" she whispered. The next day, Ilara arrived for her shift with a newspaper tucked under her arm. It had become her routine, reading the daily news to Magnus. The doctors said stimulation was important, even if they doubted he could hear anything. "Good morning, Mr. Rowan," she said cheerfully, setting down her coffee. "I hope you slept well. I certainly didn't. My neighbor's dog decided 3 a.m. was the perfect time for a barking concert." She pulled a chair closer to his bed and unfolded the newspaper. "Let's see what's happening in the world today. Your company's stock is up 2 points, by the way. Apparently, your stand-in CEO is doing something right." As she read business updates, medical breakthroughs, and local news, Ilara occasionally glanced at Magnus's face, looking for any reaction, a twitch, a flutter of eyelids, anything. But he remained still, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, assisted by machines. "You know," she said, folding the paper, "I think you can hear me. The doctors say it's pointless, but what do they know? They're not in there with you." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I found a letter yesterday. It seemed important. If you can hear me, if you're trapped in there somewhere, I want to help." Nurse Hoffman walked in, clipboard in hand. Talking to vegetables now, Vaughn? That's a bit sad, even for you. Elara straightened up. Studies show that coma patients can often hear what's happening around them. Studies also show that when your brain is scrambled like eggs, you don't come back the same. Hoffman checked the charts and smirked. Don't waste your youth on a lost cause. After Hoffman left, Elara felt a surge of defiance. She pulled out a book from her bag, The Count of Monte Cristo. Don't listen to her. I thought you might enjoy something different today, she told Magnus. My dad used to read this to me when I was sick. It's about a man who was wrongfully imprisoned and lost everything, but he never gave up. Hours passed as Elara read aloud, her voice filling the quiet room with tales of revenge and redemption. Sometimes she paused to explain a character or share her thoughts. I always wondered if I'd have the strength to survive what Dante did, she admitted. Being buried alive in your own body, it must feel similar to what you're experiencing now. As the evening approached, Elara had to finish her shift. She marked the page and closed the book. We'll continue tomorrow, I promise. Just as she was about to leave, something caught her eye. Magnus's index finger. It moved, just slightly, a tiny twitch, but she was certain she saw it. Magnus, she gasped, rushing to his side. Can you hear me? Move your finger again if you can hear me. Nothing happened. She waited, heart pounding, but the moment had passed. Was it just a reflex, a random nerve firing, or had he actually responded to her voice? Elara reported the movement to Dr. Marshall, who immediately tempered her excitement. Involuntary movements are common in coma patients, he explained. It doesn't necessarily indicate consciousness. But what if it does? She pressed. What if he's trying to communicate? Elara, the doctor said gently, using her first name for once. I understand you want to help him, but false hope can be dangerous, for you and for his family. That night, as Elara prepared to leave the hospital, a strange feeling washed over her. She found herself returning to Magnus's room one last time. The night shift nurse hadn't arrived yet, and the room was dark except for the glow of monitors. Elara approached the bed and took Magnus's hand in hers. I believe you're in there, she whispered, and I'm not giving up on you. As she turned to leave, a soft sound stopped her in her tracks. A whisper, barely audible above the beeping machines. Help! Elara spun around, her heart racing. Magnus? But his eyes remained closed, his body still. Had she imagined it? The monitor showed no change in brain activity. Everything was normal, except it wasn't. Because as she stood there, frozen in disbelief, she couldn't shake the feeling that Magnus Rowan had just spoken to her. And if he had, it meant two things. He was conscious, trapped inside his own body, and he was terrified. Elara looked around the empty room, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they both were. I'll help you, she promised, her voice trembling. Whatever's happening, I'll find out. As she left the hospital that night, Elara didn't notice the black car parked across the street, nor did she see the camera lens that followed her all the way home. Something had awakened in room 307, but it wasn't just Magnus Rowan. It was something far more dangerous, a truth that someone would kill to keep hidden. The next morning, Elara arrived earlier than usual. She hadn't slept well, the whisper from Magnus's room haunting her dreams. She needed to know if she had imagined it. The day shift was just beginning, nurses and doctors bustling around with fresh energy. Elara headed straight for room 307, but stopped short when she saw Dr. Marshall and two men in expensive suits standing outside Magnus's door. Nurse Vaughn, Dr. Marshall called her over. These gentlemen are from Rowan Industries. They'd like to speak with you. The taller man extended his hand. James Whitley, Chief Legal Officer. This is Victor Chen, Head of Security. Elara shook their hands, noticing how firm their grips were. Nice to meet you. Is everything okay? We understand you reported some activity from Mr. Rowan yesterday, Whitley said, his voice smooth but eyes calculating. Just a finger movement, Elara explained, and ... She hesitated, unsure whether to mention the whisper. And, Chen prompted, his expression unreadable. Nothing? Just the movement? Whitley and Chen exchanged glances. We appreciate your attention to Mr. Rowan's care, Whitley said, but we want to clarify something. Any observations about Mr. Rowan's condition should be reported directly to Dr. Marshall or to us. Not to other staff, not to visitors, and certainly not to press. Of course, Alara nodded, confused by their intensity. I would never— Good, Chen interrupted. Mr. Rowan's privacy is paramount. His business interests are sensitive. After they left, Alara turned to Dr. Marshall. What was that about? The doctor sighed. Magnus Rowan isn't just any patient. His condition affects stock prices, business deals, even political relationships. They're just being cautious. But as Alara entered Magnus's room, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Why would a finger twitch cause such concern? She went about her routine, checking vitals and adjusting medication. But when she was sure no one was watching, she leaned close to Magnus. I heard you last night, she whispered. If you can hear me, I'm here to help. But I need a sign, something that can't be dismissed as a reflex. Hours passed with no response. Alara read to him, told him about her morning, even played some music she thought he might like. Nothing. By late afternoon, doubt had crept in. Maybe Nurse Hoffman was right. Maybe she was wasting her time talking to someone who would never respond. As her shift ended, Alara packed up her things, disappointed. I'll be back tomorrow, she told Magnus. Sleep well. She was almost at the door when she heard it. Not a whisper this time, but a soft tap. Turning slowly, she saw Magnus's index finger tapping weakly against the bed rail. Once, twice, 3 times. Not a random twitch, a deliberate movement. Oh my God, she breathed, rushing back to his side. You can hear me. You're conscious. His finger tapped once more, as if in confirmation. Tears sprang to Alara's eyes. I knew it. I knew you were in there. She grabbed his hand. I'm going to help you. We'll find a way to communicate. Just then, the door opened and Nurse Hoffman walked in. Alara quickly let go of Magnus's hand. Still here, Vaughn? Your shift ended 20 minutes ago. Just saying goodnight, Alara said, struggling to contain her excitement. I'll see you tomorrow. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with questions and possibilities. Magnus was conscious, trapped inside his body, unable to move or speak except for that single finger. It was a condition she'd read about, locked-in syndrome. Not a coma at all, but something perhaps even more terrifying. But why would the doctors misdiagnose him? And why were Rowan Industries executives so concerned about her observations? Then there was the torn letter, the warning about company records, the mention of people dying. It all felt connected to Magnus's current state. Alara got out of bed and opened her laptop. It was time to learn everything she could about Magnus Rowan, his business, his enemies, and the accident that had put him in that hospital bed. News articles described the accident as a single-vehicle crash on a mountain road. Magnus's car had gone off a cliff, and he was lucky to have survived at all. The cause was determined to be brake failure, an accident. Or was it? As Alara dug deeper, she found articles about Magnus's business practices, aggressive takeovers, controversial deals, employees who claimed they were fired for questioning company policies. He had made enemies, certainly, but one article caught her attention. Just 2 weeks before his accident, Magnus had abruptly canceled a major merger with a pharmaceutical company called Nexus Biotech. No explanation was given, but the cancellation had cost both companies millions. Alara was so absorbed in her research that she almost missed the sound, a soft knock at her door. She froze. It was 3 a.m. Who would be at her door at this hour? The knock came again, more insistent this time. Cautiously, Alara approached the door and looked through the peephole. A woman stood outside, tall, elegantly dressed despite the hour, with sharp features that seemed vaguely familiar. Who is it? Alara called. My name is Selina Rowan, the woman replied. We need to talk about my brother. Magnus's sister? Here, at her apartment, in the middle of the night? Alara hesitated, her hand on the door lock. Every instinct told her not to open it. How did you find my address? That's not important, Selina said, her voice tight with urgency. What matters is Magnus. I know you've noticed something. I need to know what it is. Alara's mind raced. How did Selina know she'd noticed anything? And why come to her apartment instead of speaking at the hospital? I'm sorry, but this is inappropriate, Alara said firmly. If you want to discuss your brother's care, please come to the hospital during visiting hours and speak with Dr. Marshall. There was a long pause. You don't understand what you're involved in, Selina finally said, her voice dropping to a whisper. For your own safety, stay away from my brother. Footsteps receded down the hallway, and Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She grabbed her phone, ready to call security, when a text message appeared from an unknown number. Room 307's cameras are being monitored. Be careful what you say. Bring the letter tomorrow. Alara's hands shook as she read the message. How did they know about the letter? And who were they? Sleep was impossible now. Alara sat by her window until dawn, watching for the black car she was now certain had followed her home. It wasn't there, but that didn't mean she wasn't being watched. One thing was clear, Magnus Rowan wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a mystery, one that could be dangerous to solve. But as Alara prepared for her shift, she made a decision. She would help him, not just because it was her job, but because she now believed his life depended on it. And perhaps, she realized with a chill, her own life did too. When Alara arrived at the hospital the next morning, she found Dr. Marshall waiting for her, his expression grave. There's been a change of plans, he said. You're being reassigned to the general ward. What? Why? The Rowan family has requested a more experienced nurse for Magnus. Nurse Hoffman will be taking over. Alara felt her heart sink. But I've been making progress with him. I think he's responding to my voice. Dr. Marshall's eyes darted around nervously. Alara, listen to me carefully. Sometimes in this profession, we need to know when to step back. Are you saying this isn't about my experience level? He lowered his voice. I'm saying Magnus Rowan's condition is complicated, medically and otherwise. The family has concerns. Celine Rowan? Alara asked, watching his reaction. Dr. Marshall's eyes widened slightly. You've met her? She came to my apartment last night, at 3 a.m. The doctor paled. That's highly inappropriate. I'll speak with hospital security. There's something else you should know, Alara continued, deciding to trust her instincts. I think Magnus is conscious, not in a coma at all, but locked in. He tapped his finger deliberately when I asked for a sign. Dr. Marshall studied her face, then checked his watch. Come with me. He led her to a small conference room and closed the door. What you're describing would be extremely rare. The brain scans don't indicate that level of consciousness. But what if someone altered the scans? Alara asked. What if someone doesn't want Magnus to wake up? That's a serious accusation. I found a letter in his possessions, Alara admitted. It mentioned company records, something dangerous that people would kill to keep secret. Dr. Marshall ran a hand through his graying hair. This sounds far-fetched. Then let me prove it. Give me one more day with him. If he doesn't respond, I'll accept the reassignment without complaint. After a long moment, the doctor nodded. One day, but I'm going to be monitoring you. And Alara, be careful. If what you're suggesting is true, you're putting yourself at risk. Back in room 307, Alara found Magnus just as she'd left him. But something felt different. The room had been rearranged slightly. Items moved, as if someone had been searching for something. Good morning, Mr. Rowan, she said loudly for the benefit of anyone who might be listening. Then she leaned closer, adjusting his pillows, and whispered, Blink once if you can hear me. Nothing happened. Your sister visited me last night, she continued quietly. She seemed concerned about what I might have noticed. Tap your finger if you're afraid of her. Still nothing. Alara's heart sank. Had she imagined the response yesterday? Then, so subtly she almost missed it, Magnus's eye, his right eye, opened just a fraction. It wasn't a full blink, but it was deliberate. And in that sliver of visible iris, Alara saw something that chilled her. Absolute terror. You are conscious, she whispered. You're trapped. His eye closed again, but his message was clear. Magnus Rowan was awake, aware, and desperately afraid. And Alara was now his only hope. Later that evening, Alara sat in the hospital cafeteria, her untouched coffee growing cold. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Magnus Rowan was conscious but trapped in his own body, and someone, possibly his own sister, wanted to keep him that way. You look like you've seen a ghost, said a voice. Alara looked up to find Sarah, one of the ER nurses, sliding into the seat across from her. Long day, Alara replied, forcing a smile. I heard you got the Millionaire assignment. How's that going? Before Alara could answer, the cafeteria doors opened and a woman walked in, tall, with dark hair pulled into a sleek bun. She commanded attention without effort. Her designer clothes and confident stride screamed wealth and power. "That's her," Alara whispered. "Celine Rowan." Sarah's eyes widened. "Magnus Rowan's sister? I didn't even know he had a sister." "Half-sister, apparently." Celine approached the nurse's station just outside the cafeteria, speaking to the head nurse with a cool authority that bordered on rudeness. Even from a distance, Alara could see the staff's discomfort. "She's been coming at odd hours," Alara said quietly. "Never during regular visiting times." "Rich people make their own schedules," Sarah shrugged. "But why are you whispering?" Alara hesitated. How much could she trust Sarah? How much could she trust anyone in this hospital? "Just tired," she said finally. "I should get back to my patient." As Alara stood to leave, she noticed Selena watching her from across the room, her gaze calculating and cold. Alara nodded politely and headed for the elevator, fighting the urge to run. When she reached Magnus's room, she found Selene already there, standing at the foot of his bed. "How?" Alara began, then stopped herself. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize you'd be visiting now." Selene smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I like to be unpredictable. Keeps people on their toes." She moved toward Magnus, stroking his arm with manicured fingers. "My poor brother, always so strong, and now look at him." "He's fighting," Alara said carefully. "His vitals are strong." "Yes, he always was stubborn." Celine's eyes never left Magnus's face. "The doctors say it's hopeless, you know, that his brain activity is minimal. Sometimes medical science can't explain everything." Celine's gaze snapped to Alara. "What do you mean by that?" "Just that miracles happen. Patients surprise us." "Has my brother surprised you, Nurse Vaughn?" The use of her name, when Alara was certain she hadn't introduced herself, sent a chill down her spine. "I should check his medication," Alara said, moving toward the IV stand. Celine stepped aside, but continued watching. "You're very dedicated to him." "To all my patients." "Of course." Celine reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone. "I need to make a call. Perhaps you could give me a moment of privacy with my brother?" It wasn't really a request. Alara nodded and stepped outside, but instead of walking away, she lingered near the door, which hadn't fully closed. Celine's voice drifted into the hallway, hushed but clear. "No, nothing's changed. The nurse is becoming a problem. Yes, I'm handling it. No, he's still unresponsive, but we need to move quickly." Alara's heart pounded. She leaned closer, straining to hear. "You promised this would be over by now," Celine continued, her voice sharp with frustration. "The board is getting nervous." "Yes, I understand the stakes. He must never wake up. Do you understand me? Never." Blood rushed in Alara's ears. This wasn't just suspicious anymore. It was confirmation. Celine wanted Magnus to stay in his coma. Forever. The footsteps approaching the door gave Alara barely enough time to move. She hurried a few steps down the hall and pretended to be reviewing a chart when Celine emerged. "He's all yours," Celine said, her composure perfect once again. "I'll be back tomorrow to discuss his care plan with Dr. Marshall." "Of course. Good night, Ms. Rowan." Celine paused. "You know, Nurse Vaughn, dedication is admirable, but sometimes it's wise to know when to let go." Her smile was sharp as a blade. "Especially when the situation is beyond help." After Celine left, Alara rushed back to Magnus's room and closed the door. Her hands trembled as she checked his vitals, her mind reeling from what she'd overheard. "She doesn't want you to wake up," she whispered to Magnus. "Why? What do you know that's so dangerous?" She looked at his face, searching for any sign of response. His expression remained blank, but his right index finger moved slightly, a tiny, deliberate tap against the sheet. Alara made a quick decision. She pulled out a small notebook from her pocket. "I'm going to ask you yes or no questions. Tap once for yes, twice for no." "Can you do that?" 1 tap. "Is Celine trying to harm you?" 1 tap. "Does it have something to do with your company?" 1 tap. "Is it related to the letter I found, the one about company records?" 1 tap, more forceful this time. Alara's mind raced. "Is someone altering your medical treatment to keep you in this state?" 2 taps. "So, your condition is real? The accident caused this?" 1 tap. "But Celine doesn't want you to recover?" One tap. Ilara sat back, processing this information. Magnus, I want to help you, but it's dangerous, isn't it? One tap. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. I won't abandon you. We'll figure this out together. As she said this, she noticed something she hadn't before. A tear sliding slowly down Magnus's cheek. It was the most human, most vulnerable thing she'd ever seen from the powerful businessman. Ilara gently wiped it away. I promise, she whispered, I'll help you find a way out of this. The next morning, Ilara arrived at the hospital early, determined to gather more information. Her first stop was the medical records department. Good morning, Jenny, she greeted the records clerk. I need to review Magnus Rowan's file. Again? Jenny looked confused. You just had it yesterday. Ilara kept her expression neutral. I did? Well, not you specifically. Dr. Marshall requested it, said you needed to review something. Right, of course, Ilara nodded. I just need to double-check something. Jenny handed over the thick file. Make sure you sign it back in when you're done. In a quiet corner, Ilara opened the file and began comparing it to her notes from previous days. Almost immediately, she noticed discrepancies. The latest brain scan showed significantly less activity than the one she'd seen just 2 days ago. And Magnus's medication had been altered, increased dosages of sedatives, decreased physical therapy recommendations. Someone had changed his medical records, making his condition appear worse than it was. Ilara discreetly took photos of the altered pages with her phone, then returned the file to Jenny. Her next stop was the hospital pharmacy. Hi, Tom, she said to the pharmacist. I need to verify something about Mr. Rowan's prescriptions. Tom checked his computer. The changed order came in yesterday. Increased lorazepam, new muscle relaxant. Who authorized it? Ilara asked casually. Dr. Marshall, of course. But Ilara had known Dr. Marshall for 3 years. He was thorough, cautious. He would never increase sedatives for a coma patient without a compelling reason, unless someone had pressured him. Back in Magnus's room, Ilara found him as she'd left him, still, silent, but somehow more alert, as if waiting for her. They've changed your medications, she told him quietly. They're keeping you sedated. One tap from his finger. I need to find out why Celine is doing this. What's in those company records that's so dangerous? She thought for a moment. Can you spell it out for me? I'll go through the alphabet and you tap when I reach the right letter. It was slow, painstaking work. Magnus's finger movements were weak, and sometimes Ilara had to repeat letters, but eventually she pieced together a message. Nexus drug trial deaths. Ilara's blood ran cold. Nexus, the pharmaceutical company that Magnus had abruptly canceled a merger with just before his accident. People died in a drug trial, she whispered, and Nexus covered it up? One tap. And you discovered this in company records? One tap. That's why you canceled the merger. One tap. And then you had your accident. One tap, followed by what seemed like a frustrated attempt to move his hand more. There's more, Ilara realized. Something about Celine. One tap. Before she could continue, the door opened and Dr. Marshall walked in, followed by 2 hospital administrators Ilara didn't recognize. Nurse Vaughn, doctor, Marshall said, his voice strangely formal. These gentlemen need to speak with you. The taller administrator stepped forward. We understand you accessed Mr. Rowan's medical records this morning. Yes, as part of my care duties, Ilara replied, trying to keep her voice steady. And you took photographs of those records. Ilara felt her stomach drop. That's a serious violation of hospital policy and patient privacy, the second administrator cut in. We'll need your phone, please. You can't just take my personal property, Ilara protested. We can if it contains confidential patient information. It's in your employment contract. Ilara looked at Dr. Marshall, expecting support, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. Fine, she said, handing over her phone. But I want to know why Magnus Rowan's medical records were altered yesterday. His brain activity readings have been changed, and his medication increased for no medical reason. The room went silent. The administrators exchanged glances. These are serious allegations, the first administrator said finally. We'll need to discuss this privately. As they led her from the room, Ilara glanced back at Magnus. His face remained impassive, but she caught the slight movement of his finger, tapping rapidly, desperately against the sheet. A warning. In a small conference room, Alara faced the administrators and Dr. Marshall. The atmosphere was tense, hostile. "Your allegations are concerning," the first administrator said. "But so is your behavior, taking photos of confidential records, making accusations about record tampering." "I can prove the records were changed," Alara insisted. "The brain activity scans from 3 days ago show significantly more response than yesterday's scans." "Medical conditions fluctuate," the second administrator said dismissively, "especially with brain injuries." "And the medication changes," Alara pressed. "Increasing sedatives for a coma patient?" Dr. Marshall finally spoke. The patient was showing signs of agitation. The sedatives were to prevent self-harm. "Agitation or attempts to communicate?" Alara challenged. The room fell silent again. Dr. Marshall looked uncomfortable, but the administrator's expressions hardened. "Nurse Vaughn," the first administrator said coldly, "your emotional involvement with this patient has clouded your professional judgment. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending an investigation." "You can't do that," Alara gasped. "Magnus needs... What Mr. Rowan needs is professional care free from conspiracy theories," the second administrator interrupted. "Security will escort you from the building. Do not attempt to contact the patient or access hospital records during your suspension." Stunned, Alara watched as they called hospital security. This couldn't be happening. Without her, Magnus was completely vulnerable to whatever Selene was planning. As security led her through the hospital corridors, Alara caught sight of Selene Rowan, standing near the nurses' station. Their eyes met, and Selene smiled. A cold, triumphant smile that confirmed everything. This wasn't about hospital policy. This was about silencing her. Outside the hospital, Alara sat in her car, hands shaking on the steering wheel. She had been naive to think she could fight this alone. Selene Rowan had power, connections, and clearly the hospital administration in her pocket. But Alara couldn't give up. Magnus was counting on her. Somehow, she had to find a way back to him. Then she remembered. The photos on her phone weren't the only evidence she had. There was still the letter, the torn half she'd found in Magnus's belongings. She'd taken it home the night before, intending to study it more closely. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And maybe, just maybe, it could lead her to whoever had written it, someone else who knew Magnus's secrets. As Alara drove home, she didn't notice the black car that pulled away from the hospital parking lot and followed her at a careful distance. Back in her apartment, Alara pulled out the letter and spread it on her kitchen table. The handwriting was distinctive, flowing yet precise. A woman's hand, she guessed. But who? She studied the paper itself. Expensive stationery, slightly yellowed with age. The tear was jagged, as if the letter had been ripped in haste. And there, in the corner, was something she hadn't noticed before. A tiny embossed symbol, barely visible. A stylized N intertwined with what looked like a DNA helix. Nexus Biotech. The letter had come from someone at Nexus, warning Magnus about the very company they worked for. A whistleblower. Alara grabbed her laptop and searched for information about Nexus Biotech. News articles mentioned the failed merger, stock prices dropping, and then, 3 months ago, a press release announcing the sudden death of Dr. Lydia Chen, Nexus's head of research, in a tragic home accident. An accident. Just like Magnus's. Heart racing, Alara dug deeper. Social media searches revealed photos of Nexus company events. And there, in a picture from last year's holiday party, stood Magnus Rowan next to a striking Asian woman with intelligent eyes and a serious expression. The caption identified her as Dr. Lydia Chen. They knew each other, and now one was dead, the other locked in his own body. A loud knock at her door made Alara jump. She quickly closed her laptop and gathered the letter, shoving it into a drawer. "Who is it?" she called, approaching the door cautiously. "Delivery for Alara Vaughn," a male voice replied. Alara didn't remember ordering anything. She peered through the peephole and saw a delivery man holding a small package. "You can leave it at the door," she said. "Need a signature, ma'am?" Reluctantly, Alara opened the door, keeping the security chain in place. The man held out a clipboard. "Just sign here." As Alara reached for the clipboard, the man suddenly pushed against the door. The security chain snapped, and Alara stumbled backward. The man charged in, followed by another figure, Selene Rowan. Ms. Vaughn, Celine said calmly, as if they were meeting for coffee. We need to talk. The delivery man, clearly no delivery man at all, closed the door and stood guard. What do you want? Ilara demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite her terror. I think you know, Celine replied, her eyes scanning the apartment. Where is it? Where's what? Don't play dumb. The letter, Magnus's letter. Ilara's mind raced. How could she get out of this? The man blocking the door was twice her size, and Celine's cold composure suggested she was capable of anything. I don't have it, Ilara lied. It's at the hospital, in Magnus's things. We've searched. It's not there. Celine stepped closer. You've been causing quite a lot of trouble, Ms. Vaughn. Asking questions, taking photos, making accusations. Your brother is conscious, Ilara said boldly. He can communicate, and he told me everything about Nexus, about the drug trials, about the deaths you helped cover up. A flicker of surprise crossed Celine's face, quickly replaced by amusement. Did he now? Impressive for a man who can't even blink. He can. You've been sedating him to hide it. Celine sighed. And who's going to believe you? The emotionally unstable nurse who got suspended for violating hospital policy, who's been making wild claims about a vegetative patient suddenly communicating. She was right, Ilara realized with dismay. She had no credibility, no proof except a torn letter and the word of a man who couldn't speak. What are you going to do? Ilara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kill me like you killed Dr. Chen? Like you tried to kill your own brother? For the first time, Celine looked genuinely startled. You know about Lydia. I know enough, and others do too. It was a bluff, but Ilara's only hope. Celine studied her for a long moment, then nodded to the man. Search the place. Find the letter. As the man began tearing through her belongings, Celine turned back to Ilara. You have no idea what you've stumbled into. This is bigger than Magnus, bigger than Nexus. People with more power than you can imagine are involved. People who would kill to keep their secrets? In a heartbeat. Celine's smile was chilling. But perhaps we can come to an arrangement? You seem intelligent, dedicated. Those qualities could be valuable to us. You want me to help you keep Magnus prisoner in his own body? I want you to be realistic. Magnus made his choice when he threatened to expose the trial results. He knew the risks. So you admit you had him run off the road? Had his brakes cut? Celine laughed softly. You watch too many movies, Ms. Vaughn. Accidents happen all the time, especially to people who make powerful enemies. The man returned, holding the letter. Found it, he said gruffly. In a kitchen drawer. Celine took it, examining it closely. Just as I thought. You only have half. Enough to raise questions, not enough to prove anything. She folded it and slipped it into her handbag. Now, about our arrangement? A sudden noise outside the apartment made them all freeze. Footsteps, then a knock at the door. Ilara, it's Sarah from the hospital. You left your badge in the cafeteria. I thought you might need it. Celine's eyes narrowed. She gestured for the man to be silent and motioned for Ilara not to respond. But Ilara saw her chance. Sarah, she shouted. Call the police! There are intruders in my... The man moved with surprising speed, clamping a hand over Ilara's mouth. Celine pulled something from her purse, a small syringe. This is unfortunate, she said coldly. I was hoping for cooperation. Outside, Sarah was pounding on the door. Ilara, I'm calling security. Footsteps retreated rapidly. Celine glanced at the door, then back at Ilara. Change of plans, she said briskly. We're leaving, now, and you're coming with us. The man began dragging Ilara toward the door, his hand still over her mouth. She fought desperately, kicking and thrashing, but his grip was like iron. Just as they reached the door, it burst open. But it wasn't Sarah or security. It was a young man Ilara had never seen before, tall, with intense eyes and a determined expression. Let her go, he commanded, his voice quiet but authoritative. The man holding Ilara hesitated, looking to Celine for instruction. Celine's composure cracked slightly. You, she hissed. How did you... The letter was bait, the young man said, and you took it. Now let her go, or the files Dr. Chen gave Magnus go public right now. You're bluffing, Celine said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. Am I? The young man held up a phone. One text, and everything gets sent to every major news outlet. The trial data, the cover-up, your involvement, everything. For several tense seconds, no one moved. Then Celine nodded slightly and the man released Alara, shoving her toward the newcomer. "This isn't over," Celine said, her voice deadly quiet. "You have no idea what forces you're challenging." "Maybe not," the young man replied, "but we're willing to find out." Celine and her henchmen backed out of the apartment, disappearing down the hallway. Alara collapsed into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Who are you?" she asked the stranger who had just saved her life. He closed and locked the door before answering. "My name is David Chen. Lydia was my sister." His eyes were hard with grief and determination. "And I think we have a lot to talk about." Alara's apartment was quiet except for the ticking of her kitchen clock. David Chen sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The resemblance to his sister Lydia was clear now, the same determined eyes, the same intensity. "Lydia knew something was wrong with the drug trial data months before anyone else," David explained. "The mortality rates were being hidden, adverse reactions downplayed. When she brought it to her superiors at Nexus, they told her to ignore it. But she didn't," Alara guessed. "Number? That wasn't who she was." Pride and grief mingled in his voice. "She started gathering evidence secretly. Then she found out about the merger with Rowan Industries. And she went to Magnus." David nodded. Lydia knew his reputation, ruthless in business but ethical. She thought he could help expose Nexus without destroying her career. What she didn't realize was how deep the conspiracy went. "What do you mean?" The drug trial wasn't just about a failed medication. It was about a cover-up that reached into government regulatory agencies, other pharmaceutical companies, even foreign interests. David pulled out a flash drive from his pocket. "This contains everything Lydia collected. Magnus was the only other person who had a copy." "And then they both had accidents," Alara said quietly. "Exactly. Lydia's brakes were cut, just like Magnus's. Only she wasn't as lucky." David's voice broke slightly. "She died instantly." Alara reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm so sorry, but I don't understand. Why didn't you go to the police?" "With what evidence?" "The flash drive is encrypted, and I don't have the key. Lydia gave it to Magnus for safekeeping, and without proof, it's just another conspiracy theory." His eyes met hers. "That's why I need your help. Magnus is the only one who can unlock this information." "But he can barely communicate," Alara said. "And now I've been suspended from the hospital. I can't even get near him." "We'll find a way," David said firmly. "We have to. People are still dying from this drug. It's been quietly rebranded and pushed into markets with less regulation. More trials are happening right now." Alara thought for a moment. "There might be someone who can help us." Dr. Marshall seemed uncomfortable with what was happening. "I think he's being pressured, but maybe he could be convinced to help." "It's risky." "Everything about this is risky," Alara countered. "But Magnus trusted him enough to choose his hospital for recovery." David considered this. "All right, but we need to be careful. Celine clearly has resources and influence. She'll be watching you." "We need to act fast," Alara said. "Celine was pushing the hospital to withdraw life support. Now that she knows I've discovered Magnus is conscious, she might accelerate her plans." "Then we move tonight," David decided. "Can you get us into the hospital after hours?" Alara hesitated only a moment. "My friend Sarah works the night shift. She might help us. But what's the plan once we're in?" "First, we need to communicate with Magnus about the encryption key. Then we need proof of his consciousness to protect him legally." David's expression hardened. "And we need to keep him alive long enough to expose the truth." As they prepared to leave, Alara felt a mixture of fear and determination. Hours ago, she had been merely concerned about a patient. Now she was part of something far bigger. A conspiracy involving corrupt corporations, covered-up deaths, and people willing to kill to protect their secrets. "Are you sure you want to do this?" David asked, sensing her hesitation. "Once we start, there's no going back." Alara thought of Magnus, trapped in his own body, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "Let's go." The hospital looked different at night, shadows longer, corridors emptier, the usual bustling energy replaced by an eerie quiet. Sarah had met them at a side entrance, her face pale with worry. You have 20 minutes, she whispered, handing Alara her ID badge. Security does rounds at 2 a.m. You need to be gone by then. Thank you, Sarah, Alara said gratefully. If anyone asks, I never saw you, Sarah finished. Be careful, Alara. Whatever you're involved in, it feels dangerous. It is, Alara admitted, but it's the right thing to do. She and David made their way through the dimly lit corridors, avoiding the night staff. When they reached room 307, Alara pressed her ear to the door, checking for voices. Hearing nothing, she swiped Sarah's badge and pushed the door open. Magnus lay as always, still and pale in the hospital bed. But something was different. New machines had been brought in, with monitors Alara didn't recognize. What are those? David whispered, eyeing the equipment. Alara checked the settings and felt her blood run cold. They're preparing him for transport. They're moving him. When? Tomorrow morning. She pointed to the transfer orders on the clipboard. To a private facility in Switzerland, once he's out of the country. We'll never reach him? David finished grimly. We need to wake him up, now. That's impossible. Even if we took him off the sedatives, it would take hours for them to clear his system. David pulled a small vial from his pocket. Lydia developed this. It's an anti-sedative compound designed to quickly counteract benzodiazepines in overdose cases. It was never approved because it was deemed too aggressive, but it works. That's experimental, Alara protested. It could kill him. Celine will kill him for sure, David countered. This might be his only chance. Alara looked at Magnus, remembering his desperate attempt to communicate, the trust he'd placed in her. What would he choose? Do it, she decided, but we'll need to be ready if something goes wrong. As David prepared the injection, Alara checked Magnus's vital signs and adjusted the monitors to temporarily silence any alarms. Then she took Magnus's hand and leaned close to his ear. Magnus, we're going to try something risky to help you wake up, she explained softly. If you can hear me, we need you to fight. Fight harder than you've ever fought before. David inserted the needle into Magnus's fourth line and slowly pushed the plunger. For several tense moments, nothing happened. Then Magnus's heart rate began to increase, his breathing becoming more rapid. It's working, David whispered. Alara watched the monitors carefully. His blood pressure is rising, oxygen levels stable. She squeezed Magnus's hand. Magnus, can you hear me? At first, there was only the quickening beep of the heart monitor. Then, so subtle they almost missed it, Magnus's eyelids fluttered. Come on, Alara urged. You can do this. Come back to us. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, thunder rumbled. A storm was approaching. The hospital lights flickered once, then again. Something's happening, David said, watching the power fluctuate. Suddenly the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Emergency generators kicked in seconds later, bathing everything in a dim red glow. Perfect timing, Alara muttered. The backup power won't run all the monitoring equipment. We need to... Her words died in her throat as she felt something impossible, Magnus's hand tightening around hers. Not just a finger tap, but a real grip. Magnus, she gasped, leaning closer in the dim light. His eyes opened, fully this time, wide and alert. They darted around frantically before focusing on her face. Alara, he rasped, his voice barely audible after months of disuse. You're not safe. Here. The words sent chills down her spine, not just because of their meaning, but because Magnus Rowan, the man doctors had declared vegetative, was speaking. He was awake. Before she could respond, the door burst open. Dr. Marshall stood there, silhouetted against the emergency lights in the hallway, his expression a mixture of shock and fear. What have you done? He whispered, staring at Magnus's conscious form. Saved his life, David replied firmly. The life you helped put at risk. Dr. Marshall stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. You don't understand. They'll kill all of us. Who? Celine? Nexus? Alara demanded. All of them, the consortium. Dr. Marshall ran a hand through his hair. They've been monitoring everything. They'll know he's awake. Then help us get him out of here, David urged, before they come. For a moment, Dr. Marshall seemed paralyzed by indecision. Then determination replaced fear on his face. All right, but we need to move fast. Magnus tried to sit up but lacked the strength. Months in a hospital bed had weakened his once powerful frame. My legs, can't feel them properly. It's the lingering sedatives and muscle atrophy, Alara explained, helping him up. It will pass. Can you tell us about the encryption key for Lydia's files? Recognition flashed in Magnus's eyes as he saw David. Chen, you're her brother. His voice was becoming stronger. The key, it's in my head. Memorized. Trust no one else. Dr. Marshall was gathering medical supplies. We'll need to take a wheelchair. The service elevator at the end of the east corridor is the only way out not covered by security cameras. How do you know that? David asked suspiciously. Because I've been looking for a way to help Magnus for months, Dr. Marshall replied. But they threaten my family. My daughter's car accident last year, it was a warning. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows. The backup power flickered again. They're cutting the emergency generators, Dr. Marshall said tensely. Standard procedure during security breaches. We have minutes at most. Together, they helped Magnus into a wheelchair. His movements were uncoordinated, his muscles weak, but his mind was sharp, eyes constantly scanning for threats, mind calculating escape routes even in his compromised state. Wait, Magnus said as they prepared to leave. My watch, in the drawer. Alara retrieved it, an expensive timepiece that looked ordinary enough. Magnus took it with shaking hands. It's not just a watch. It contains a microchip with backup data, insurance policy. Clever, David said with grudging admiration. They moved into the hallway, keeping to the shadows. The hospital was in controlled chaos, staff dealing with the power outage while trying to maintain patient care. In the confusion, a man in a wheelchair barely drew notice. As they approached the service elevator, Ilara's phone vibrated, a text from Sarah. Security looking for you. They know. They're on to us, she warned. Dr. Marshall pressed the elevator call button repeatedly. Come on, come on. The elevator doors finally opened, revealing an empty car. They rushed inside, Doctor. Marshall hitting the button for the underground parking level. My car is there, he explained. We can... His words were cut off by the elevator jerking to a halt between floors. The emergency lights went out, leaving them in total darkness. They've overridden the system, Magnus said calmly. Standard containment protocol. David pulled out his phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the small space. What now? There should be a maintenance hatch, Doctor, Marshall said, pointing to the ceiling. We can climb out and reach the next floor. Magnus can't climb, Alara protested. I can try, Magnus insisted, struggling to stand. Help me up. Before they could move, the elevator lurched, beginning to descend again. Someone's reactivated it, Alara said nervously. Magnus gripped the armrests of the wheelchair. Get ready. When those doors open, it won't be rescue. The elevator reached the parking level and came to a stop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doors slowly opened. Celine Rowan stood there, flanked by 4 men in dark suits. Her expression showed no surprise at seeing her brother conscious. Only cold calculation. Magnus, she said evenly, nice to see you're finally up and about. Your timing, as always, is impeccable. Celine, Magnus replied, his voice carrying surprising authority despite his weakened state. It's over. The backup data is already being transmitted. A flicker of doubt crossed Seleni's face. You're bluffing. You've been unconscious for months. Have I? Magnus raised an eyebrow. Or was I gathering evidence the entire time, learning who was involved, who gave the orders, who profited from all those deaths? Ilara watched this exchange in fascination. Even wheelchair-bound and physically diminished, Magnus Rowan commanded the space, his intelligence and strategic mind fully intact. Celine's composure slipped slightly. The consortium won't allow this, Magnus. You know what they're capable of. I do, but unlike you, I'm not afraid of them. Magnus's voice hardened. You betrayed me, Celine, your own brother. For what? Money? Power? For survival, she shot back. You were always so idealistic, so sure of your moral high ground. Some fights can't be won, Magnus. Some enemies can't be defeated. Magnus leaned forward. Watch me. One of Celine's men stepped forward, hand moving inside his jacket. Dr. Marshall, with surprising speed for his age, launched himself at the man. They crashed into a parked car, setting off its alarm. The piercing noise shattered the tension, and chaos erupted. David grabbed the handles of Magnus's wheelchair, pulling him backward as another guard advanced. Alara snatched a fire extinguisher from the wall and sprayed it at the remaining men, creating a momentary smokescreen. "My car!" Dr. Marshall shouted over the noise, throwing his keys to David. "Blue sedan, Section C." They fled through the parking garage, the alarm still blaring. Behind them, shouts and running footsteps indicated pursuit. Magnus, despite his weakness, had taken control. "Left at the next corner," he directed. "The garage has a service exit that bypasses the main gate." Sure enough, they found a small door marked "Maintenance Only." David's hand shook as he tried the doctor's keys in the lock. "Hurry," Alara urged, looking back. Shadows were approaching. The lock clicked open, and they pushed through. Outside, rain poured in sheets, instantly soaking them. The service exit led to a small alley behind the hospital, away from the main entrance. "Where's the car?" Alara asked, scanning the area. "There." David pointed to a blue sedan parked under a dim streetlight. As they rushed toward it, headlights suddenly blinded them. A black SUV screeched to a halt, blocking their path. Two men jumped out, weapons drawn. "End of the road," one called over the downpour. "Mr. Rowan, you need to come with us." Magnus, still in the wheelchair, seemed surprisingly calm. "Tell your employers it's too late. The information is already being distributed to every major news outlet. The trial data, the falsified results, the names of everyone involved." "He's bluffing," the second man said. "The data is still encrypted." "Is it?" Magnus smiled thinly. He held up his watch. "I just activated the transmission, 30 seconds ago. Check your phones if you don't believe me." The men hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. One pulled out his phone, his expression changing as he read something on the screen. "Sir," he said to his partner, "we have a situation. Orders coming into retreat now." "What? But now," the first man insisted, already backing toward their vehicle. "It's gone public. Damage control protocols are being initiated." As suddenly as they had appeared, the men retreated, the SUV speeding away into the stormy night. For a moment, the small group stood in shocked silence, rain cascading around them. "Did you really release the data?" Alara asked Magnus. Magnus's smile held a hint of his former power. "The moment I activated my watch, yes. I built in a dead man switch years ago. If I didn't reset it every 72 hours, it would automatically upload everything to a secure server and distribute it to a list of trusted journalists and authorities." "And the sedatives prevented you from resetting it?" David realized. "Exactly. Celine thought keeping me unconscious was the solution, but it was actually her undoing." Magnus attempted to stand, his legs shaky but supporting him. "We need to move quickly. The consortium will be in chaos, but that makes them more dangerous, not less." They reached Dr. Marshall's car, helping Magnus into the back seat. As David started the engine, Alara looked back at the hospital one last time. In the distance, she could see figures running through the rain toward the main entrance, Selena and her men, presumably. "Where do we go now?" David asked, pulling onto the rain-slicked street. "Somewhere they won't look for us," Magnus replied. "Somewhere we can regroup and prepare for what comes next." "What does come next?" Alara asked. Magnus took her hand, his grip firmer now. "Justice," he said simply. "For Lydia, for the trial victims, for everyone hurt by this conspiracy. But first," his voice softened. "Thank you, Alara, for believing in me when no one else would, for seeing me when everyone else had given up." As the car sped through the stormy night, Alara realized her life had irrevocably changed, from nurse to conspirator, from caregiver to fugitive. But looking at Magnus, awake, determined, alive, she knew she had made the right choice. The buried truth had finally surfaced, and nothing would ever be the same again. 3 days later, Alara stood at the window of a secluded lakeside cabin, watching the sun rise over the water. They had been hiding here since their escape from the hospital, a property owned by Dr. Marshall through a shell company untraceable to him or Magnus. "Coffee?" David appeared beside her, offering a steaming mug. "Thanks." She accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "How's Magnus?" "Improving faster than I would have thought possible. His speech is almost back to normal, and he's regained most of his motor skills." David's expression showed reluctant admiration. The man is determined. I'll give him that. In the short time she had known him conscious, Alara had witnessed Magnus's extraordinary willpower firsthand. Despite months of muscle atrophy and the lingering effects of powerful sedatives, he pushed himself relentlessly, doing physical therapy exercises for hours, refusing help even when his legs gave out beneath him, working his mind with complex cognitive exercises to ensure no lasting damage from his ordeal. He's in the study now, David continued, going through Lydia's files. With the encryption key, we finally have access to everything she discovered. The cabin door opened, and Dr. Marshall entered, carrying groceries. His face looked tired but resolute. He had risked everything to help them, his career, his reputation, potentially even his freedom. "Any news?" Alara asked as she helped him with the bags. "It's everywhere," he replied, pulling out a newspaper. Front page of every major publication. The headline screamed, "Pharmaceutical Scandal, Dozens Dead in Covered-Up Trial." Below it, a subheading, "Billionaire Magnus Rowan Emerges from Coma to Expose Conspiracy." The initial data release has done exactly what Magnus intended, Dr. Marshall explained. Created too much public interest for them to contain. The consortium is in damage control mode. "What about Celine?" David asked, scanning the article. "No mention yet. She's gone underground according to my contacts. But Magnus thinks she'll surface soon." As if summoned by his name, Magnus appeared in the doorway. The change in him after just 3 days was remarkable. Though still thinner than in the photos Alara had seen of him before the accident, he stood tall, his posture straight, eyes clear and focused. He had trimmed his beard and cut his hair, looking more like the powerful CEO from business magazines, and less like the vulnerable patient she had cared for. "She'll come for us," Magnus said, his voice strong and certain. "Selene doesn't give up easily. None of them do." "The files are damning," David argued. "The evidence is public now. What can she possibly do?" "Damage control," Magnus replied grimly, which, in the consortium's playbook, means eliminating loose ends. "Us." He walked to the table with only a slight limp, a vast improvement from the wheelchair-bound man they had rescued. The files proved the drug trial deaths and the cover-up, but not who was ultimately responsible, not who gave the orders. "And you know who did?" Alara asked. Magnus nodded. "I suspected before. Now I'm certain." He spread several documents on the table. Selena wasn't just involved. She was the architect. She orchestrated the entire cover-up while serving as Nexus's silent partner. David's face darkened. "She had my sister killed." "Yes," Magnus confirmed. "Lydia discovered Selena's involvement and came to me. That's why I canceled the merger. I couldn't align my company with Nexus knowing what I knew. But I underestimated my sister. I never thought she'd try to kill me." "Half-sister," Dr. Marshall corrected. Magnus glanced at him. "Yes. Perhaps that made it easier for her." There was a flicker of genuine pain in his eyes, quickly masked. "The important thing now is to complete what Lydia started. We have the evidence of wrongdoing, but we need to prove Selena's direct involvement to bring her down." "How do we do that?" Alara asked. "She's clearly careful enough not to leave a paper trail." "Not entirely." Magnus pulled out a particular document. This email chain shows communications between SR, and several Nexus executives discussing how to handle the problematic trial results. SR suggests using alternate research sites with more flexible regulatory environments to continue testing. "That could be anyone with those initials," David pointed out. "Yes, but combined with this," Magnus produced another document. "A transfer of funds from an offshore account registered to a shell company that I've traced back to Selene to pay for the new trials. It creates a compelling case." "It's still circumstantial," Dr. Marshall said, "which is why we need her to incriminate herself directly." Magnus's expression was calculating now, the brilliant strategic mind that had built his empire working at full capacity. "And I know exactly how to make that happen." Later that afternoon, they finalized their plan. Magnus would announce a press conference at his corporate headquarters, his first public appearance since awakening from his coma. The announcement would mention new evidence regarding responsible parties to be revealed. "She won't be able to resist," Magnus explained. "Selene will try to stop me before I can publicly name her, and when she does, we'll be ready." It's dangerous, Alara argued. You're making yourself a target. I already am a target, Magnus countered. We all are. This way, we choose the battlefield. Dr. Marshall nodded reluctantly. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow at noon. I've arranged security with people I trust personally. What about the hospital? Alara asked. Won't I face charges for helping Magnus escape? Already handled, Magnus assured her. My legal team has filed formal complaints about the altered medical records and inappropriate sedation. The hospital board is scrambling to distance themselves from any wrongdoing. In fact, they're portraying you as a hero now, the dedicated nurse who recognized signs of consciousness when everyone else had given up. Alara shook her head in disbelief. Amazing how quickly the narrative can change. Money and power, David said cynically. They determine which version of the truth prevails. Not always, Magnus replied, his eyes meeting Alara's. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stand up for what's right, regardless of the consequences. That night, unable to sleep, Alara stepped outside onto the cabin's small porch. The moon reflected off the lake, creating a silvery path across the dark water. She heard the door open behind her and turned to see Magnus, also apparently restless. Mind some company? He asked. Not at all. He joined her at the railing, his movement still slightly stiff but markedly improved. Beautiful night, he observed, looking up at the stars. Yes, Alara agreed. Hard to believe everything that's happened, looking at this peaceful scene. Beauty and danger often coexist. Magnus's voice was thoughtful. I've been wanting to thank you properly, Alara. What you did for me, there's no way to repay that kind of courage. I was just doing my job, she said, feeling suddenly self-conscious. No. His voice was firm. What you did went far beyond professional duty. You saw me when no one else could. You heard me when everyone else had stopped listening. Alara felt a lump in her throat. I just couldn't accept that you were gone. Something told me you were still in there, fighting. I was. Every day was a battle not to surrender to the darkness. His hand moved closer to hers on the railing. Your voice was my anchor. When you read to me, told me stories, shared your life, it gave me something to hold on to. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of shared experience creating an intimacy neither had expected. Are you afraid? Alara finally asked. About tomorrow? Yes, Magnus admitted, surprising her with his honesty. Not of Celine exactly, of what she represents, the darkness in people that allows them to sacrifice lives for profit, to betray those who trust them. People like her can't win, Alara said with conviction. Not in the long run. I hope you're right. He turned to face her fully. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that meeting you has changed me. Before all this, I was different. Success and power were everything. Now I understand what really matters. The intensity in his eyes made Alara's heart race. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, might move closer. But a sound from inside the cabin broke the spell, and the moment passed. We should try to rest, Magnus said, stepping back slightly. Tomorrow will test us all. As Alara returned to her room, she felt a strange mixture of emotions, fear about what lay ahead, but also something unexpected, something that felt dangerously like hope. Morning came too quickly. They gathered their evidence and prepared to leave the safety of the cabin for the confrontation that awaited. Dr. Marshall would drive Magnus directly to Rowan Industries headquarters. David and Alara would follow separately, taking a different route as a precaution. Remember, Magnus instructed as they made final preparations, once we're at headquarters, trust no one except my head of security, Thomas Reed. He's the only one I'm certain isn't compromised. What makes you so sure? David asked skeptically. Because he's the one who found the evidence of brake tampering on my car after the accident, Magnus explained. He kept it quiet at my request, but he's been working to uncover the truth ever since. They parted ways with a sense of foreboding. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just their personal safety, but justice for Lydia Chen and dozens of unnamed victims of corporate greed. Alara and David drove in tense silence for the first half of the journey. Finally, David spoke. Are you in love with him? The question caught Alara off guard. What? No, It's okay if you are, David said, keeping his eyes on the road. I've seen how you look at each other. Just be careful. Magnus Rowan is used to power, to control. Men like that don't change easily, even after something like this. You don't know him, Alara said defensively. Neither do you, not really. You know the patient you cared for, the vulnerable man fighting for his life. But who is he when that vulnerability is gone, when he's back in his tower, running his empire? Alara had no answer. The truth was, she had wondered the same thing herself. They arrived at Rowan Industries' imposing headquarters, building an hour before the press conference. Security was tight, with news vans already lining the street. Inside, they were met by Thomas Reed, a stern-faced man with military bearing who escorted them to a private elevator. Mr. Rowan is waiting in the conference room, Reed informed them. The press is being screened in the lobby. Security personnel are stationed throughout the building. The elevator ascended to the top floor, Magnus's domain. Stepping out, Alara was struck by the contrast between this gleaming corporate fortress and the hospital room where she had first truly met him. Here, everything spoke of power and success, minimalist luxury, sweeping views of the city, staff moving with precision and purpose. Reed led them to a large conference room where Magnus stood looking out over the city. He had transformed completely, now dressed in an impeccable suit, his posture confident. He was every inch the billionaire CEO. For a moment, Alara barely recognized him. Then he turned, and his eyes found hers. The connection she had felt at the cabin was still there, unchanged by the setting or his restored appearance. "You made it safely?" he said, relief evident in his voice. "Any signs of surveillance?" "None," David replied, "but that doesn't mean they're not watching." Dr. Marshall entered the room, looking tense. "The press is assembling downstairs. We should review our strategy one last time." They gathered around the conference table, going over the plan. Magnus would begin the press conference with a statement about his recovery and the pharmaceutical scandal. Then he would present the evidence linking Selene directly to the cover-up, forcing her hand. "We have security footage of all entrances," Reed explained. "If Selene attempts to enter the building, we'll know immediately." "She won't come through the front door," Magnus said confidently. "She'll find another way. She always does." As the time for the press conference approached, tension in the room grew. Alara noticed Magnus rubbing his temple, a gesture she recognized from his hospital days, a sign of stress or pain he was trying to hide. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. "Just a headache," he assured her. "Lingering effect of the medications, probably." Reed's phone buzzed. "The press is ready, sir. It's time." Magnus nodded, squaring his shoulders. "Let's finish this." They made their way down to the large auditorium where the press conference would take place. Seated in the front row, Alara could feel the anticipation in the room. Cameras flashed as Magnus approached the podium, his slight limp barely noticeable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong and clear, "thank you for coming. 3 days ago, I emerged from what was erroneously reported as a coma. In truth, I was conscious but unable to communicate. A victim not just of a car accident, but of deliberate medical malpractice designed to keep me silent." A murmur ran through the assembled journalists. Magnus continued, outlining the scandal involving Nexus Biotech, the drug trial deaths, and the cover-up. With each revelation, the room grew more charged with shock and outrage. "But today," Magnus said, his voice dropping slightly, compelling everyone to lean forward, "I want to address who was behind this conspiracy. Who orchestrated not only the cover-up, but the attempt on my life." At that moment, the lights in the auditorium flickered. Once, twice, then stabilized. Reed immediately spoke into his radio, alerting security to check the electrical systems. Magnus barely paused. "The person responsible is someone who betrayed not just public trust, but personal trust. Someone who put profit above human lives. Someone who—" The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Emergency lighting activated seconds later, casting an eerie glow over the confused crowd. Security personnel moved quickly to surround Magnus. "Everyone remain calm," Reed called out over the growing noise. "We're experiencing a technical difficulty." Alara stood, searching for Magnus in the confusion. She spotted him still at the podium, Reed at his side. Then she saw something that made her blood freeze, a red dot, moving across Magnus's chest. A laser sight. "Magnus!" she screamed. "Get down!" Her warning came just as Reed also spotted the threat. He lunged, pushing Magnus to the floor as a shot rang out. Chaos erupted, people screaming and diving for cover. Security swarmed toward the source of the shot, a balcony at the back of the auditorium. In the mayhem, Alara lost sight of Magnus. She pushed against the tide of fleeing journalists, fighting to reach the podium. When she finally broke through, she found Reed restraining someone, a security guard in Rowan Industries uniform. "He's with them," Reed explained grimly, securing the man's hands behind his back. "Where's Magnus?" "I thought he was with you," Alara replied, panic rising in her throat. "Split up," Reed ordered. "Doctor, Marshall, take the east exit. David, west. Alara, check the service corridor behind the stage. I'll secure this one and then follow you." Alara rushed to the service corridor, her heart pounding. The narrow hallway was dimly lit by emergency lights casting long shadows. "Magnus," she called out, hearing the fear in her own voice. A sound from an adjacent room caught her attention. A muffled thump. She approached cautiously, pushing the door open. Inside, she found Magnus struggling with a woman, Celine. She had a syringe in one hand, inches from Magnus's neck as they fought. "You always were stubborn," Celine was saying through gritted teeth. "It would have been so much easier if you just stayed asleep." "Celine, stop!" Alara shouted. Celine's head snapped toward her, momentarily distracted. Magnus used the opportunity to knock the syringe from her hand. It skittered across the floor, coming to rest near Alara's feet. "It's over, Selena," Magnus said, breathing heavily. "Security is already on their way." "You think I came alone?" Selene laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "The consortium has people everywhere, even here, in your precious company." "We know," Magnus replied, "and we've been removing them, one by one, ever since I woke up. Your network is collapsing, Celine." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Selena's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Magnus stood taller now, his authority fully restored. "How do you think we identified your shooter so quickly? How do you think we knew about your back entrance to this building? We've been one step ahead of you from the moment I opened my eyes." Celine's composure cracked. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. The people behind this, they don't just kill you, they destroy everything you care about. Everyone." Her eyes flicked to Alara, a threat implicit in her gaze. Magnus shifted subtly, placing himself between the two women. "Those people are scrambling to save themselves now," he said quietly. "They've already started turning on each other, including you, Celine. Why do you think they sent you in here alone? You're the sacrifice." Doubt crept into Celine's expression. Before she could respond, the door burst open. Reed and several security officers rushed in, quickly restraining Celine. "We've secured the building," Reed reported. "Police are on their way. The shooter is in custody." "And the evidence?" Magnus asked. "Safe. Dr. Marshall and Mr. Chen are guarding it personally." As Celine was led away, she locked eyes with Magnus one last time. "This isn't over, brother. It will never be over." "For you it is," Magnus replied, his voice tinged with genuine sadness beneath the resolve. When they were alone again, Alara approached Magnus tentatively. "Are you hurt?" "No," he assured her, though he looked exhausted. "Thanks to you. Again." "What happened? How did she get to you?" Magnus sighed heavily. "She used an old private entrance we'd designed for emergencies, one I'd forgotten about until it was too late." He ran a hand through his hair. "The irony isn't lost on me. Saved by the same woman who once kept me alive, in more ways than she knew." They made their way back to the main area, where order was slowly being restored. Journalists were being debriefed by police. Security was sweeping the building, and the evidence against Celine and her conspirators was being officially documented. "What happens now?" Alara asked as they watched the activity unfold. "Justice, I hope," Magnus replied. "For Lydia, for the trial victims, for everyone hurt by this conspiracy." He turned to face her. "And then, rebuilding, for all of us." The weight of his words hung between them, full of possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Whatever came next, one thing was clear. The deadly betrayal had been exposed, but the story was far from over. 2 weeks later, Alara stood at the back of a packed courtroom, watching as Celine Rowan was led in by court officers. The once elegant businesswoman looked diminished in her plain prison jumpsuit, though her posture remained proud, her gaze defiant. The preliminary hearing had drawn national attention. Reporters filled the public gallery, sketching furiously as cameras weren't allowed. The charges against Cellini were severe: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, corporate fraud, and criminal negligence resulting in multiple deaths. If convicted on all counts, she faced life in prison. "All rise," called the bailiff as the judge entered. As the proceedings began, Ilara felt a presence beside her. Magnus had slipped in quietly, wearing a dark suit and sunglasses to minimize recognition. He had been keeping a low profile since the press conference, focusing on rebuilding his health and preparing for the legal battles ahead. "I didn't expect to see you here," Ilara whispered as they sat down. "I needed to see her face," Magnus replied softly, "to make sure this is real." They watched as the prosecutor outlined the case against Celine. The evidence was damning: emails, financial records, witness testimonies, and most devastating of all, Cellini's own words recorded during the confrontation at Rowan Industries. When it was time for Cellini to enter her plea, the courtroom fell silent. She stood slowly, scanning the room until her eyes found Magnus. For a brief moment, something passed between the siblings, a complex mixture of hatred, betrayal, and perhaps a flicker of what might have once been familial love. "Not guilty," Cellini declared, her voice steady. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge set a trial date and denied bail, citing flight risk and the severity of the charges. As Cellini was led away, she looked back once more at Magnus, her expression unreadable. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, recognizing Magnus despite his attempt at anonymity. He handled them with practiced ease, making a brief statement about justice and accountability before security helped clear a path to his waiting car. "Come with me," he said to Ilara, holding the car door open. "There's something I need to show you." They drove through the city in silence, eventually arriving at a modest building in a quiet neighborhood. Unlike the imposing Rowan Industries headquarters, this place was understated, almost anonymous. "What is this?" Ilara asked as they entered. "The future," Magnus replied, leading her into a bright, open space where a dozen people worked at computers or gathered around whiteboards covered in diagrams and notes. David Chen was among them, deep in conversation with a group of scientists. He looked up as they entered, nodding in acknowledgement. "After Lydia's death," Magnus explained, "David approached me about creating something meaningful from the tragedy. We've been planning this for months, though my accident delayed the launch." He gestured around the room. "This is the Chen Foundation for Ethical Medicine. We're using funds from my personal fortune and the settlement from Nexus to create an independent watchdog organization. We'll monitor pharmaceutical trials, investigate concerns raised by whistleblowers, and advocate for patient safety." Ilara took in the scene, understanding dawning. "This is how you're making amends." "It's a start," Magnus acknowledged. "Nothing can bring back those who died, but we can try to prevent it from happening again." He hesitated. "I was hoping you might consider joining us. Your medical background, your integrity, your courage. We need people like you." Before Ilara could respond, Dr. Marshall approached, looking more relaxed than she had seen him since the hospital escape. "The board is ready whenever you are," he informed Magnus. "They're eager to hear your vision for the Foundation's first initiatives." Magnus nodded. "I'll be right there." As Dr. Marshall walked away, he turned back to Ilara. "Think about it. No pressure, but I believe you could do extraordinary work here." With a gentle squeeze of her hand, he left to join the meeting, leaving Ilara to process everything. David approached, offering her coffee from the break room. "He's different now," David observed, following her gaze as Magnus addressed the board members. "Still driven, still intense, but the focus has changed. It's about purpose now, not just power." "Do you trust him?" Ilara asked. David considered the question. "I'm getting there. He's kept every promise he made, fought for justice for Lydia when he could have just saved himself. That counts for something." He gave her a knowing look. "But the real question is, do you trust him?" Before she could answer, a commotion erupted at the entrance. Security guards were restraining someone, a man in a business suit who looked vaguely familiar to Ilara. "That's Victor Chen," David said tensely. "Head of security at Rowan Industries, one of the men who questioned you about Magnus's finger movement." Magnus emerged from the conference room, his expression hardening at the sight of his former employee. "Let him in," he instructed security. Victor Chen straightened his jacket as the guards released him. "Mr. Rowan," he said stiffly, "we need to talk, privately." "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here," Magnus replied coldly. Chen glanced around nervously. "You've made powerful enemies, sir. The consortium isn't finished. They're regrouping, planning their next move." "Is that a threat, Victor?" "A warning from someone who was once loyal to you." Chen's voice dropped. "They're going public tomorrow. A press conference claiming you manufactured evidence against Celine, that you're using the scandal to eliminate rivals and take control of Nexus yourself." Magnus remained impassive. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because unlike some, I have limits," Chen replied. "Attempted murder crosses a line. And because—" He hesitated. "I respect what you're building here. It's what the industry needs." A tense silence followed as Magnus evaluated Chen's sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you for the warning. Now get out." After Chen left, the room buzzed with concerned discussion. The foundation was still fragile, its reputation tied directly to Magnus's credibility. A coordinated attack could destroy everything before it even began. "We need to get ahead of this," Dr. Marshall advised. "Release our own statement. Present the evidence publicly before they can spin their narrative." "No," Magnus said firmly. "That's defensive thinking. We need to be bold." He turned to his team. "They want to hold a press conference? Fine, we'll be there, ready to challenge every lie with documented facts. We'll bring the victims' families, the whistleblowers, everyone whose lives were affected by their greed." David looked skeptical. "That's risky. We'd be walking into their territory." "Exactly," Magnus replied. "They're expecting us to hide, to react. We'll take the fight to them instead." His eyes found Alara's. "If you're willing to stand with us, your testimony about what you witnessed in the hospital would be powerful." Alara felt the weight of everyone's attention. This was no longer just about one patient or one corporation's misdeeds. It was about systemic corruption that cost lives, about the choice between comfortable silence and difficult truth. "I'll do it," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the tension gripping the small team as they prepared for the confrontation ahead. Magnus had worked through the night, reviewing evidence, refining their strategy, ensuring every claim they made could be thoroughly documented. Alara found him alone in the conference room, staring at a photograph, Magnus and Celine at some corporate event, both smiling, her arm around his shoulders. "I still don't understand why," he said without looking up. "We weren't close, but I never thought she'd try to kill me." "Power changes people," Alara said gently, taking a seat beside him. "So does fear." "Fear? Doctor?" Chen's files showed how deep the conspiracy went. Government officials, regulatory agencies, competing companies. Selena must have felt trapped between them and you, the ethical brother who would expose everything. Magnus put the photo down. "I keep thinking about those moments in the hospital when I was aware but couldn't move, couldn't speak, hearing her voice as she told the doctors to gradually reduce my care, knowing my own sister wanted me dead." His voice held a rare vulnerability. In some ways, that was worse than the physical paralysis. Alara reached for his hand, understanding the unique horror he had endured. "But you survived. You fought back. Because of you." His eyes met hers, intense and sincere. "Your voice, your compassion, your belief that I was still there, it gave me something to fight for." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then David knocked on the doorframe, breaking the spell. "It's time," he announced. "They're setting up for their press conference." The consortium had chosen an upscale hotel for their event, clearly aiming for an atmosphere of respectability. By the time Magnus and his team arrived, the ballroom was already filling with journalists and corporate representatives. At the front of the room, a panel of somber-faced executives sat behind a long table, including several Nexus board members and representatives from affiliated companies. Leading them was a distinguished older man Alara didn't recognize. "Vernon Hastings," Magnus murmured to her, "chairman of Farm Alliance, the largest pharmaceutical lobby in the country. If he's involved, this goes even higher than we thought." They took seats at the back of the room, deliberately visible but not disruptive. A ripple of recognition spread as people noticed Magnus's presence, whispers and surprised glances passing through the crowd. Hastings approached the podium, his grandfatherly appearance projecting trustworthiness and wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. We've called this press conference to address disturbing allegations made against respected members of the pharmaceutical community and to present facts that have been deliberately obscured from public view. What followed was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak. Without directly calling Magnus a liar, Hastings painted a picture of a vindictive businessman using tragedy to eliminate competition. He described Selene as a scapegoat, a convenient target for public anger. He presented carefully selected data, suggesting the trial deaths were within acceptable statistical margins, tragic but not criminal. Most concerning, Hastings continued smoothly, is the apparent manufacturing of evidence to support these wild accusations. We have expert analysis indicating that key documents released to the press were altered to implicate specific individuals. David tensed beside Alara. "They're good," he whispered. "Very good." When the formal presentation concluded, Hastings opened the floor for questions. Journalists began the expected softball exchanges, clearly intimidated by the powerful figures before them. Then Magnus stood. The room fell silent as he walked confidently to the center aisle. Gone was any trace of his recent physical weakness. He radiated strength and certainty. "Mr. Hastings," he called out clearly, "I have some questions about your presentation." Hastings faltered momentarily, though he quickly recovered. "Mr. Rowan, this is unexpected. Of course, you're welcome to ask questions, though given your personal involvement, I'm sure you understand if we question your objectivity." "My first question is simple," Magnus continued, undeterred. "Are you aware that this entire press conference is being streamed live to the offices of the federal prosecutor, complete with your internal planning documents showing your strategy to discredit victims and whistleblowers?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Hastings' professional smile thinned. "That's a rather dramatic claim, Mr. Rowan, and quite impossible, since there were no such planning documents." "No?" Magnus removed a small device from his pocket. "This was in your conference room during your preparations yesterday. One of your own staff placed it there, someone whose conscience finally outweighed their fear." The journalists were fully engaged now, cameras turning from the panel to Magnus. "Furthermore," Magnus continued, "I've brought some people you should meet." He gestured to the back of the room, where David was escorting in a group of solemn-faced men and women. "These are family members of those who died in the Nexus trials, people whose grief you just dismissed as statistically acceptable." The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably as the families took their places, their presence a stark rebuke to the clinical corporate presentation. "And this," Magnus indicated a folder David was distributing to journalists, "is the complete, unredacted data from the trials, including documented evidence of results that were deliberately excluded from regulatory filings. Each of you will find the names of independent experts who can verify its authenticity." Hastings attempted to regain control. "These theatrical tactics may make for good television, Mr. Rowan, but they don't change the facts." "Speaking of facts," Magnus replied, his voice hardening, "let's discuss your personal investment in Nexus through offshore shell companies, and your direct communications with Selene Rowan about how to handle problematic trial results. Those communications have also been provided to federal investigators." For the first time, real fear flickered across Hastings' face. The other executives exchanged alarmed glances. "This is slander," Hastings blustered. "You'll be hearing from our attorneys." "I look forward to discovery," Magnus replied coolly. Then he turned to address the room directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, for too long, corporations like these have placed profit above human lives, believing their power made them untouchable. Today, that changes." Ilara stood and joined him, followed by Dr. Marshall, David, and the victims' families. Together, they formed a powerful visual counterpoint to the increasingly uncomfortable executives. "My name is Ilara Vaughn," she stated clearly into the suddenly attentive room. "I was Magnus Rowan's nurse during his recovery from the assassination attempt orchestrated by this consortium. I personally witnessed attempts to keep him sedated, to alter his medical records, and ultimately to eliminate him when those efforts failed." One by one, others stepped forward. A former Nexus researcher who had been silenced, a regulatory official who had been pressured to approve the drug despite safety concerns, family members with heartbreaking stories of loved ones lost to corporate callousness. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated defense by powerful corporations transformed into a devastating public exposure of their crimes. Journalists rushed to file breaking stories. Cameras focused on the increasingly empty executive table as members made hasty exits, and social media exploded with real-time coverage. By the time it was over, Magnus had achieved something unprecedented. He had turned their own forum against them, using their platform to deliver a killing blow to their credibility. Outside the hotel, as reporters clamored for additional comments, Magnus addressed his team privately. "This is just the beginning," he told them. "They'll regroup, try new tactics. But today we showed them, and the world, that no one is above accountability." Alara watched him with admiration and something deeper. The Magnus who had orchestrated this decisive victory was not just the powerful businessman she had first learned about, nor just the vulnerable patient she had cared for. He was something altogether new, a man transformed by his experience, using his considerable power and strategic mind for justice rather than merely success. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of that day rippled through the pharmaceutical industry. Hastings resigned in disgrace. Multiple executives faced criminal charges. Regulatory agencies launched comprehensive investigations. The Chen Foundation became a trusted watchdog, its findings respected and feared by corporations worldwide. Celine's trial proceeded swiftly, the new evidence making her defense untenable. When the jury returned after just 3 hours of deliberation, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. As she was led away to begin her lengthy sentence, she looked back at Magnus one final time. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them, the closing of one chapter, the acknowledgement that their shared story had reached its inevitable conclusion. On the evening after the verdict, Alara found Magnus on the rooftop garden of the Foundation building, watching the sunset over the city skyline. "How does it feel?" she asked, joining him at the railing, "knowing it's really over?" "Not over," he replied thoughtfully. "Just changing. The work we're doing here will continue for years. There will be other Nexus biotechs, other conspiracies to uncover. Is that why you've been so quiet today? Thinking about the challenges ahead?" Magnus turned to face her fully. "Partly, but mostly I've been thinking about second chances, about how rare they are, and how easily we can waste them." "You haven't wasted yours," Alara assured him. "What you've built here is extraordinary. I'm not talking about the foundation," his voice softened. "I'm talking about life itself. When I was trapped in that hospital bed, unable to move or speak, I made promises to myself about what I would do if I ever got a second chance. The foundation was one of those promises. But there was another, more personal one." He took her hand, his touch gentle but certain. "I promised myself that if I ever found someone brave enough, kind enough, and strong enough to see beyond wealth and power to the person beneath, I wouldn't let fear hold me back from telling them how I felt." Ilara's heart raced as his meaning became clear. "Magnus, you saved more than my life, Alara. You saved my humanity. You reminded me what really matters." He reached into his pocket and removed a small key. "This is for you." "What is it?" she asked, taking it curiously. "It opens a cottage on a small island I own, a place I've never shown anyone else. It's where I go when I need peace, when I need to remember who I really am beneath all the trappings of Magnus Rowan, CEO. His eyes held hers. "I'd like to show it to you, if you want." The key felt warm in Alara's palm, its significance far beyond the physical door it would open. It represented trust, vulnerability, a future neither of them could have imagined when she first entered room 307. "I'd like that," she said softly. As the sun set behind them, casting golden light across the rooftop garden, Magnus drew her closer. The journey that had brought them here had been filled with danger and darkness, but it had led to something unexpected and precious. A connection forged in the most unlikely circumstances, a bond strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. "Whatever comes next," Magnus promised, "we face it together." And as their lips met in the fading light, Ilara knew that the greatest plot twist of all had been this: finding love in the midst of conspiracy, discovering hope in the shadow of betrayal, building a future from the ashes of the past. Some stories, it seemed, could have happy endings after all. If you enjoyed this incredible journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.